Welcome to episode 15 of Inspect. My name is Ajay Karwal, and my guest this week is someone I've been looking forward to speaking with for a while now. He's the host of Developer Tea, a podcast about some of the less talked about skills required to be a good developer. He's also co-founder of the Spec network of podcasts and CTO at Whiteboard. It's my pleasure to welcome to the show Jonathan Cutrell. Welcome to the show, Jonathan.
Thank you so much for having me. I've really enjoyed the episodes that I've heard of Inspect, and I've been trying to coordinate with you for a long time. I'm really bad at email, actually. Of all the things that I do, email's probably the last on my talent list.
Yeah, it's been a long time coming, hasn't it? We've been sort of, throwing dates back and forth for quite a while now. But it's good to finally have you on. Like I mentioned, I've wanted to have you on as a guest for quite a while. If you've ever listened to any of the previous episodes, you may have heard me mention a few times that Developer Tea was actually the first tech podcast that I subscribed to, and it was kind of the inspiration for me to want to get into doing podcasting for myself as well. So
that's so exciting for me to hear, because I really believe podcasting can be a huge, really just a good practice for developers, quite honestly. Taking these ideas that we work with every day and creating a podcast with those ideas, it's kind of an interesting translation process, right? Have you found that that's been, it's kind of hard to explain, it's hard to verbalize some of the stuff that makes up our jobs.
Yeah. And one of the main reasons I wanted to start this in the first place was just to build up some sort of confidence for speaking about a topic at length, and something like presenting at an event is something I've always wanted to do, or just to be able to present at meetings at work and things like that. So I figured this would be a good place to start for me to just talk about a topic behind a microphone and just get comfortable with basically presenting, really. And the whole sort of interview process of throwing questions back and forth to people as well about a particular topic. And it's just good to have an opportunity to talk about development with other developers, people who I don't work with and spend time with on a daily basis, who have got very different ideas to myself and work in very different industries as well. So it's good to just get a good cross section of the industry, I suppose.
Yeah, and congratulations on doing more than what most people are able to do. I mean, putting out 15 episodes is in and of itself an accomplishment. So congrats.
Oh yeah, thank you. Still quite a few numbers away from the sort of episode count that you're on, and obviously you're releasing quite a few episodes every week, which is brilliant. But yeah, we can get into obviously your podcast and your process a little later on.
Sure.
But I thought if we could start just a little bit about who you are and what your background is, because I'm sure most of the listeners of this show probably are familiar with your show as well and may have some information about you. But for those who don't, who is Jonathan Cutrell, and where did you grow up? What your experience? How did you get into web development, and what led you up to where you are now?
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up. I have one sibling, and my parents. And we all four of us moved quite a bit when I was younger, and we moved around in the United States here. And so I was born in the western part of the country, and lived there for a couple of years. And then we moved kind of to the middle of the country. Then we moved back to the same place we were in the western part of the country. And I stayed there until I was, around fifth grade. So somewhere around 10 or 11 years old. I don't remember how old I was when we then decided to move to the southeastern part of the country. So those three areas of the country are very different from each other. And in fact, my parents lived in England for a little while.
Oh, really?
So we've been all over the place. My sister was born in middle North America, like the pretty much right in the middle north part of the United States, in a state called North Dakota. So we've been everywhere. So I had a lot of time, and my personality, I don't know if you would know this from hearing me on a podcast. I think a lot of developers have the same kind of thing, but I'm an introvert by nature. I get energy out of spending time alone. In fact, today I kind of took an off day from working, and I went and just spent time totally on my own. And if you're an extrovert, that can be really exhausting. But for me,
Yeah.
it's a recharge. So
I think that's.
being an introvert. Go
I
ahead.
think, no, I was going to say I think that's quite a common trait amongst developers as well.
Yeah, I think so too.
I was listening to an episode of Layout last week. I think it was like maybe 2 episodes ago. Layout is also on the Spec network,
Hmm.
and they were talking about being introverted and extrovert as well. And they came up with a similar conclusion that people in the sort of, design development industry are generally a little bit more introverted and like to be alone with their own thoughts and
Yeah.
not necessarily don't like being around other people, but don't really go out of their way to be the life and soul of the party, I suppose.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to recognize, and I have maybe a differing theory about introvert and extrovert, or introversion and extroversion than the average person might have. I think they aren't really on the same scale necessarily. Like, I don't think they're diametrically opposed from each other. And I
Mhm.
also think it's kind of like saying, do you like coffee or tea, right? Because there's so many different varieties of coffee and so many different varieties of tea,
Mhm.
that to say that, hey, I do like coffee, that's giving it a big lump sum kind of way of thinking about it. So being an introvert, there's so many different types of introversion. I'm an introvert that likes to be active while I'm introverted. Some introverts like to be very calm and not, not active. So there's a lot of, I can be with a very small group of people, and recharge in that scenario. I think a lot of people take on, and partially because the studies that have come out recently kind of create that diametric opposition. But I think there's a lot of people who would benefit from, not trying to become deeply one or the other, but rather recognizing parts of their personality that might fall in both. Like, I like coffee and tea, right?
Mhm.
So you don't have to dive into that, one side as your only personality trait, and create this continuum where you have to fall in one spot of it.
Yeah.
There are times in ways of my life, with Developer T, I'm talking to a very large number of people, right? And that would be an extrovert trait that I have. And so so it kind of depends on how you look at it, but I think we have a bias towards thinking in false, what is it? False dichotomy is the word for it. I've talked
Yeah.
about false dichotomies on Developer T, but we have that bias of thinking in false dichotomies because it simplifies things. And I can ask you, are you an introvert or an extrovert, and try to get a heuristic for what kind of person you are.
Sure.
But, largely speaking, I display mostly introvert traits with the occasional extrovert trait.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I suppose me starting a podcast is a step towards becoming more extrovert as well, from a generally introverted background as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's really interesting.
Well, and I think developers share that introversion because it gives us time to kind of study, right? Like, if I'm alone as an introvert, and that's not to say that extroverts don't study, but rather that the thing that I'm going to be professionally best at is going to be something where I feel okay, being alone and isolated for hours on end. And that is truly something that happens to developers regularly. We have 2 or 3 or 4 hours worth of highly focused development time. And if you can't handle that well, then being a developer that might be difficult. There are absolutely highly collaborative environments, but at some point, most likely, if you're developing anything of any consequence, unless you're constantly pair programming, there's probably going to be a period of time where you are pretty much isolated.
Yeah, definitely. So you mentioned, just going back to sort of like where you grew up and stuff. You mentioned quite a few areas around the US. So where are you based right now then? specifically?
So now I'm in Chattanooga, Tennessee, which is, if you were to get in a car and drive northwest from Atlanta, is about an hour to an hour and a half northwest of Atlanta.
Right.
It's a beautiful place.
Yeah. What's it like? I mean, what's the sort of tech scene like in that area as well?
So the tech scene is it's growing. It's been growing for a few years now. We just now downtown Chattanooga. We just now got kind of this installation, kind of institutionalized approval of something called the Innovation District, and Whiteboard is actually in that Innovation District. We were there before they called it that, but quite a few companies are kind of in that area, and there's not a lot of super well-known startups necessarily. We have a few logistics startups, a few tech-based startups, a few client agencies like Whiteboard, but the tech scene has been growing for a long time, and in part because we have basically, and this is going to sound bad, but it's actually a really good thing. We have what amounts to state-sponsored internet here. And it's not sponsored in the way that, I don't have to pay for it, but rather it's like a utility, right? So okay. The power board in Chattanooga, they created a smart grid to essentially know when power went out, right? Because TVA, which if you know much about the history of the southeastern United States, you probably know a lot about TVA. Tennessee Valley Authority was established, in the early 1900s, and basically is kind of like the people who brought power to the Southeast, for lack of a better explanation. And as a result of that, we have a lot of innovative ways of thinking about managing power and power distribution. So one of the things that EPB is the name of the company, by the way. EPB created this smart grid that basically is connected with fiber, and it reports back to a central location when power goes out, on a certain street block. And if you go look it up, they have some, like a case study or two. Basically, they've been able to decrease the amount of time that it takes, number one, to isolate where the problem is, and number two, to actually fix the problem. It's like 10 times faster with the smart grid, right? So that was like in the early... I think it was around 2010 maybe, or earlier. I actually wasn't living in Chattanooga when this happened. But after that, they realized, hey, wait a second. We've got this fiber that's running all over the city. Like it's laying over, most of Chattanooga. Why don't we use that fiber not only to communicate back, when power goes out, but also just to carry the internet, right? So they started sending really fast internet. And we were actually, I believe, the first city in the United States to get residential gigabit internet access. So at my house, I have a gigabit of, my internet speed is a gigabit. Wow. So it's super fast, right?
Yeah.
So this has enabled, this is a draw for businesses. It has enabled a lot of people, just because it has kind of that marketing major draw to say, hey, your internet bill is going to be very controlled. EPB is never going to sell your data, right? There's all of these things that, hey, I work on the internet every single day. This makes a big impact on my life, and it makes a big impact on my work. So now we have 10 gigabit that's actually available residential. I could get 10 gigabit internet connection in my house for like $200. It's crazy.
Wow, that's crazy. Yeah. I mean, I've got a 50 megabit over here in my house. That's the base. I mean, the max it goes up to is about 200.
Yeah.
Yeah, for around the same price that you're getting 10 gigabits, about 200. So.
And the truth is, you can probably do most of what you need with that 15 megabits, at least for now, right?
Yeah, it's enough for for browsing the internet, for doing my work and streaming movies and downloading music or whatever I need to do. It's enough. But obviously, more is always nice.
It helps, yeah. Well, and as media becomes more and more, higher and higher resolution, and more people have access to that media, well, now your computer is going to relatively feel slower.
Yeah, yeah, sure. All right, cool. And so you work at an agency, Whiteboard. You're the CTO of Whiteboard, right?
That's correct.
Have you been in a sort of development background for quite a while now, or is this something you sort of worked into more recently?
No, I did not come from a development background. None of my family is working in computers. When I was a young kid, my dad would assemble his own PCs. And he did that mostly, to be able to use word processing and that kind of stuff. I remember a little bit of him, running very simple commands on the command line to manage the disk and that kind of stuff, right? MS-DOS. But there wasn't a lot of that. My dad is actually a pilot and he's a mechanic, but he never really got into software development.
Sure.
My mom was a teacher, and so neither of them really had a heavy tech background. I started playing music when I was probably 10 years old. Actually, I was playing earlier, but really taking it seriously and enjoying it deeply. Started playing guitar 10, 11, 12 years old, around the time that I moved to the Southeast, actually.
Yeah.
And so I played music throughout high school. I thought I was going to go into professional musicianship. I wanted to go and basically be either I wanted to, strike it big and go and play on the road and, live that lifestyle, or I wanted to be a studio musician. Either one was okay with me. So I went to school and I started learning about, I started my music degree program, and pretty quickly realized, okay, this is not quite what I want to do. And it was kind of a weird realization, right? Because you spend a lot of your kind of passionate years as a teenager where you're forming the way that, the first time you're really thinking about what am I going to do, once I leave home is like at 13, right? And my answer to that was this thing. I wanted to go and be a musician. And so, I was in bands growing up. I was doing all that stuff. And I went to college and I started studying music, and it turns out that wasn't what I wanted to do. And I realized that it wasn't because I didn't like music anymore. I didn't suddenly lose an appreciation or love for playing, guitar, right? Instead, what I realized was most of that degree program was about training you about the theory of music,
Right.
Not training you how to be successful as a musician.
Right, yeah.
And I wanted to be successful as a musician. I wanted to spend my time, learning how to record and distribute music. I wanted to spend my time becoming better in the studio.
Yeah.
So what I decided to do was stop that degree program, which was difficult, by the way, to do because it's, again, it feels like, hey, am I throwing away my dream here? What's going on? But I stopped that degree program and instead I moved into, I actually started a journalism program, but then I switched to a communications with an emphasis in advertising. And so that's what I studied. I studied communications, and that's what I got my undergrad degree in.
Right.
During the process of getting that communications degree, I wanted to find a way to connect with the world beyond where I was. And the most natural thing to me was the internet. I wanted to take my, kind of my portfolio as a person. I didn't really, by the way, I was terrible at figuring out marketing back then, but I kind of wanted to present myself as a professional musician / designer, sort of photographer. I had like a whole list of things that I wanted the world to know about me, none of which apply today, by the way.
Don't carry on playing music now?
I do play music still, and I play mostly for myself. I play a little bit in a church that I attend here in the States, and I've recorded a few times with my wife. My wife sings, and she's a very good singer, but I haven't really tried to push that to a mainstream audience, and I don't really plan. Like I don't really have a drive to do that anymore. It's kind of a weird, and it's not because I lost a dream. It's
kind of all or nothing, isn't it?
Yeah, the music industry has kind of changed, and I don't really see why I would do that if I get fulfillment out of just playing. Like truly what I wanted to do was just play. And I didn't realize that as a teenager. I thought I wanted to be famous, and I don't really care about being famous.
Yeah, you've just got a passion for actually playing. Yeah, so don't need to do it for money. You can do something else for money and just keep that on the side. Why not?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that led me to developing websites. And
Right.
when I started, I knew nothing. I had no formal training. I had nobody who was teaching me. Quite honestly, I was Googling in my my apartment, Googling how to do certain things. I saw a site that I liked and tried to replicate some of the stuff they were doing, and didn't even know what it meant to plagiarize a website back then. I just liked it and wanted to figure out how they were doing what they were doing, and just started deconstructing things and figuring out ways of making something my own. And I ended up running into, this is super old school. And anybody who learned web development back in the 2008, 2009, you will probably recognize this. But there was a blog, or a couple of blogs actually, called the Fuel Network. And the Fuel Network was run by Adele Charles, who I believe is now working at Bitly, or she was working at Bitly as a designer. She was excellent. She had the biggest one was Fuel Your Creativity. But I actually worked as the editor.
Yeah, I remember Fuel Your Creativity. Yeah. I remember that site.
Yeah, it was an excellent site. Really good for designers that were, wanting to think, wanting to work on their kind of perception and getting involved with the community. And it actually was a really cool thing because we had the opportunity to write content that, it was one of the first blogs in that space. So in any case, I ended up being the editor of Fuel Your Interface, FYI. And I was totally underqualified. I can't believe that they actually trusted me with it. But it ended up being a really good thing because that's when I really cut my teeth on, publishing schedules and talking about things in a way that people can grasp what you're saying. And that was really, really important to even what I do today with Developer T. I started learning about that back then. So then moving forward, I ended up getting a internship as a front-end web developer. I thought that I wanted to be a designer still, and I applied for an internship as a designer. And it turns out that what I was doing with front-end web development, I didn't realize that I was actually, that was a more valuable skill set for me. I was better at that than I was at design. I had no idea because I didn't have any no reference points, right? I didn't even know what front-end developer meant. It was so early in that, at that stage. And so I got that internship, and that kicked my tail because I was presented with new problems. Like I had to build, every front-end web developer, you should have to build your own image carousel on web standards from 2011. It was it was difficult. Complete with text that was turned 90 degrees and all that stuff.
That's like the rite of passage, isn't it?
Yeah, that rite of passage was so important because that's where I started realizing, hey, this is like some really interesting and complex problem solving, and actually I love it. I really enjoy it.
That's when it was all problem solving, because it wasn't easy back then. It was
it was very different.
Yeah, you had, people had some good ideas on what they wanted to achieve, but the web just wouldn't let them. And there was all sorts of hacks to sort of bring your designs to life on the web.
It was very different. That was still when we were slicing PSDs and,
Yeah, long before Bootstrap.
Oh, yeah. Bootstrap wasn't even thought of. And in fact, Twitter was barely a thing. I mean, we're talking about, in terms of web years, this was kind of the early years still, especially in terms of like design web years, right? MySpace was just out the door. I guess it had been a little bit longer than that, but people were starting to care about design, on a popular level, right? but it was still very early. So we still had very disparate web standards between browsers, and, video, doing video work was impossible. It was very difficult. The very first sites with full screen backgrounds and that kind of thing were just now coming out. So it was right after, the fixed width, the 960 grid. It was right after that was finally people started saying, okay, we don't have to do that anymore. We can do more interesting stuff. Yeah. That's when I kind of was dropped into that internship. And after that and really during that internship as well, but after that internship, I had good friends that went to the same undergrad college as me, and they were starting a company. And, it was really cool because we worked together on projects here and there. We would, we'd get paid and split up the money and then go our separate ways. It was a lot of fun. Very interesting kind of period of my work life because, it wasn't super structured. It was in every sense of the word freelance, right? Right. And that those two guys are Taylor and Eric, and they ended up starting Whiteboard. And I actually went off to college, which is why I wasn't, one of the founders of Whiteboard. But I went off and did my master's degree, and effectively after that, came right back and started full time.
And I take it they are still with the company, and it's.
Oh yeah, and we work. We still work very closely together every day, and it's. It's a challenge to work with your friends, but it is very fulfilling when you can make it work.
Okay. I had a fairly similar sort of start to what you've mentioned as well. Again, like yourself, when I was in my, I suppose, early teens, around 13, 14, I was also really keen on becoming a musician as well. Not so much a musician. Yeah. I was actually a DJ back then. And, it started off as just something that I was doing at home, and then did DJing at parties for friends and family and stuff like that. And then as I got older, and then I started DJing in clubs and
very cool.
Took it a bit further, and did that for quite a while. And when I went to university as well, before I went to university, my intention was always to study music as well. I studied music in high school, up until the end of high school. But after that, when I went to university, I just, for some reason, I just didn't go down that path. It kind of changed my mind right at the last minute. But I always wanted to do something quite creative. I was always interested in music and drama and art and things like that. And it just so happened that I ended up on a computer science degree, where it wasn't my first choice of path to take, but that's where I ended up, and I didn't really enjoy it at that time. So while I was doing my degree, in the sort of evenings and the weekends, I was always playing around with Photoshop and just doing sort of freelance design work for other people. And this was around the time sort of MySpace was in its prime, I suppose. And I used to spend a lot of time sort of designing MySpace pages and putting together just like small websites about music or about like my favorite artists and things like that. And that's kind of where I started. So we took a fairly similar sort of route, where musical roots, and then ended up in sort of design and the sort of web industry.
It is, yeah. I was just thinking about that because I also, I did a little bit of that MySpace hacking, and I had, I guess I did have friends in high school that were interested in web development, and it was that would have been my first introduction to it. Was, seeing them make stuff and be a little bit interested in a way that wasn't really active, right? I knew it existed. I knew kind of what the different pieces and parts were, but, it wasn't until college that I found out that you couldn't use an ID twice on two HTML elements, right? Like I was that level of undereducated until later.
Well, it was a lot harder to find the answers back then as well, wasn't it? It wasn't like Stack Overflow wasn't really a thing, and there wasn't a million blogs about web development. You might have picked up a magazine. You might have a subscription to like Computer Arts or something, and there was a few web development sites and blogs, but there was a handful of them. at the
And
best.
it was actually, early high school. In fact, 8th grade, maybe before high school, and maybe even earlier. I remember I picked up a book in the library that was, make your own website or write HTML or learn HTML. And I remember reading that and not really doing anything with it, but reading it and thinking, wow. I actually remember distinctly thinking that every page that I ever visited, somebody hand coded that page.
Yeah.
Which I had no idea, back then I had no idea about PHP, or eventually I was like, wow, you can create templates and reuse them. That's awesome. And there's so much that you learn that.
Yeah. Maintaining websites when there was static HTML was a nightmare, way.
Yeah. Yeah. And, maintaining parity across them. Yeah. I can only imagine the people who first got, Perl on Apache being really excited about that.
Yeah. Developers have it too easy these days. So now you're hosting Developer Tea, which is obviously a development podcast. So what actually inspired you to start a podcast? And you've been going for around about 2 years now, is it?
Yeah, so it's coming up on 3 years in January. So it's around the corner from now to be 3 years. People ask me what inspired me to start it, and I want to answer that question, and I also want to answer the question, what inspires me to do it now? Because the original inspiration is still there, but as it's gone forward, I've learned more and more. Well, we'll get into that in a second. The original inspiration for this, it really comes down to the fact that I was listening to podcasts originally before I started my own. And the podcast I was listening to, I love Shop Talk. I love listening. I mean, there's a variety of them. I'm not going to list all of them, but Shop Talk would be a really good one for a web audience. I imagine that you and probably others have been listening to Shop Talk.
Yeah.
The rapid fire episodes and all that stuff. I could listen to those and really enjoy the content because it was highly relevant to me. And, connecting personality rather than just reading a blog, having the personalities and, that kind of warmth tied with something that was really specifically geared for me, right? As a web developer or as a software developer, really specifically speaks to some of the things that I think about and care about.
Yeah.
The problem that I faced with all those podcasts was the length of them. And because, let's say I have 5 podcasts sitting in my playlist queue, whatever, that I'm subscribed to. Well, very often 5 podcasts can take up 8 hours of your day. If you were to listen to them back to back, and they would actually take a long time. And even with the 2x features on Overcast and skipping the silences and all that stuff, the length of them was often prohibitive for me because I have like a 2-minute commute. That's another great thing about Chattanooga, by the way, is it's not super congested.
Yeah.
So to get to work, I'm like around the corner, right? So I found myself having to curate and kind of roll the dice on which one is going to be the best one to listen to. And I hated doing that because I really did enjoy all of them.
Yeah, you'd have to limit the number that you subscribe to, wouldn't you? Because
yeah,
they're all coming out at quite a regular schedule. So you're going to be hit with this hour episode at least once a week. So yeah, you can very quickly build up.
Right. And I'm really bad at listening to them while I'm working. But what I found, another inspiration that helped me get to where I ended up doing, like helped me finally decide to do Developer Tea, was actually, there's a Ruby programmer named Avdi Grimm. Avdi creates Ruby Tapas. And Ruby Tapas, if you're not familiar with Ruby Tapas, basically what he does is he creates these 5 to 8 minute videos usually, and he's extremely focused and he shows one concept and he does a lot of them. He has like 500 tapas. So what I found myself doing is, I was learning how to build better Rails applications. I found myself going and watching a Ruby Tapas video whenever I would take a coffee break. I'd go and grab a cup of coffee and I'd sit at my desk and I would watch Ruby Tapas. And I was like, this is kind of the format that I want this kind of media in.
Yeah.
I want training in this format, and I want podcasts in this format too. So I decided, that was kind of brewing in my mind a little bit, no pun intended. And, I really had for a long time wanted to start a podcast. When I was in my master's program, I'd even designed a logo for, anybody, feel free to take this, but it was called, and you know what? I think somebody actually has created a podcast called this now, but it was called Front to Back.
Yeah.
And it was going to be about front end and back end development.
Yeah, I'm a subscriber of Front to Back. They're two guys from the UK.
Okay, well, there you go. So I was going to create that podcast, but not that one. But, I had an idea for a show called Front to Back, and I never went through with it, partially because the plan to do it was, to do a Kickstarter, and really it was just way too much for me to actually get started.
Yeah.
I could have done it, but it would have been a big investment, and ultimately I decided, well, it's too big of a risk. I don't have the time to risk that much on it.
Before I started my podcast as well, I was throwing around some names on a spreadsheet, on a Google spreadsheet with a friend of mine, and one of the ones that we wrote down was Back to Front.
There you go.
And it was only until, and I remember we had a list of about 5 or 6 names, and I decided to put them all into iTunes and just see if anyone had them. And Front to Back came out. It came up in the search, and then I thought, okay, I'm not going to call it Back to Front. It's going to be too similar. But yeah, their podcast is really good as well.
That's awesome. I had the idea of doing the Kickstarter from, if anybody's wondering why I even thought about doing a Kickstarter, Roman Mars, the 99% Invisible, somebody told me he had made like some crazy number of pledges on Kickstarter, like something like $1 million. Running a Kickstarter for his podcast. And I thought, man, if he can do that, then, why can't I? Who knows what this thing is? But ultimately that was the wrong perspective, for me to have, number one. And number two, it was too much on the front end for me to get started. And I don't recommend anybody start at Kickstarter. I think it's, again, we'll get into that if we need to, but
yeah.
So I started kicking the idea around and asking friends, hey, what do you think of this? Developers, my wife, I asked her. I asked people who are not developers but work in the industry, what do you think of this idea? And I pretty much unanimously got, yeah, that sounds like a pretty good idea. I didn't get like rave reviews, nobody was like, man, that's going to be really successful, because, people throw around ideas in this industry all the time, right?
Uh-huh.
And that's actually kind of a thing that I tell people now is nobody's going to believe in your idea as much as you do, right? And just because somebody isn't super excited about it doesn't mean it's doomed or it's not going to be successful. It's one person, right? So take everybody's opinion with a grain of salt, but I continued doing research. I popped some names into iTunes just like you did. I was first going to do something related to coffee because that was my experience.
Mm-hmm.
I took a coffee break and I watched, videos, training videos, whatever. Of course, coffee is really saturated on on iTunes, so
yeah.
I had to shift gears a little bit, and I came up with Developer Tea and shot the name around to a few people, and they kind of gave it thumbs up. And so, yeah, at that point, we've already talked about my history as a musician. I already had recording gear. I had the stuff set up. Well, I had it in a closet actually, but I could set it up pretty easily, and I could actually just sit in front of a mic and start recording. And that was truly one of the biggest factors for me, the biggest factors of success. I mentioned already that doing the Kickstarter was too much, right? There's too much before I got to the first listen, before I got to the first moment where an idea was communicated to a listener.
Yeah.
And so because of that, this is like the opposite approach, right? You come up with an idea, and the fastest, like getting in front of the microphone as soon as possible was like kind of the key differentiator. I didn't even know it at the time, but getting in front of the microphone became really an extremely important kind of step in that process. So I recorded a bunch of episodes and released them, kind of expecting like, kind of like a blog, right?
Yeah.
You don't write a blog post thinking, man, this is going to explode, right? Like nobody does that.
Yeah, you're lucky if you get 1 or 2 reads on a blog post, really.
Yeah. But I hit a few lucky strides, to be honest with you. And those lucky strides, there's multiple ones along the way. And, the rest, as they say, is history.
Mm-hmm.
So that was kind of the driving purpose, is to fill this, this format niche, but also to talk about things in a kind of a broader perspective kind of way. I want to discuss softer skills, or I want to discuss, how as a person you should approach your work, not just how as a developer should you approach your work.
I think it's good that you've chosen that format as well, because there are obviously a lot of tech web development podcasts out there, and majority of them, including mine to an extent, does focus more on the sort of technology and the techniques and tips and tricks and things like that, and people don't really talk about what it takes to actually be in this industry and be a good developer and just be a good co-worker and all those sorts of things. So yeah, I really love the format, and
Thank you very much.
I think it's taught me a lot as well. Just to on persona and on attitude and just sort of giving me a bit more respect about a way to sort of respect my peers and respect other people's opinions and things like that as well, which I think is really inspiring. Yeah,
that's the goal. You've explained why I still do it today. Is that exactly?
I've just had a quick look on iTunes at your list of episodes, and it looks like you're well over 300 now, aren't you?
Oh yeah, I'm around 440 or so.
Okay, iTunes is only showing me 300, but I remember you made a big deal of the 365th episode, because obviously that's equivalent of one a day for a year.
Yeah.
I remember listening to that one. So yeah, over 400 episodes. So how do you fit that into your schedule? I suppose obviously 400 episodes at a regular schedule. Are you doing 3 a week?
I am doing 3 a week. Yeah. At one point, I actually did 4 a week for like a month. But I actually got reviews that said that the quality was suffering, so I had to scale it back down a little bit.
So 3 episodes a week while being CTO of an agency and juggling your sort of home life.
Yeah, I'm a new father as well. If you want to pile on there, yeah. This is a good question, because I think a lot of people. Well, let me back up and say that I've been extremely lucky. There are a lot of things that go my way when it comes to these episodes making it out. I think there's some things that everyone can do that I do, that I don't think are unique to me, that anybody can really take advantage of. So I'm going to talk about some of those things now. Well, first of all, I should give a lot of credit to the team that I work with. So, Spec, you've mentioned Spec.
Yeah.
Spec was started a few months into Developer Tea with the hosts of Design Details. And we had very similar audience sizes. We had very similar tones, similar kind of approaches to what a podcast should be. We had guests that come on. Their format's a little bit different. They're a little bit more polished than I am in some ways. They have 2 hosts rather than 1. They don't really do monologue style episodes, etc. But overall, we had a lot of overlap, and we decided, hey, we could really benefit from combining our efforts and doing some scale work together and that kind of thing. So we created Spec. Me, Bryn, and Brian created Spec. And not too long after we started the company, Sarah, who is currently, she's actually full-time with Spec now. She's transitioning into a leadership role at Spec. She's a huge help in getting this stuff out the door. And so what that has allowed, effectively, she edits all of the episodes. And she helps keep me on schedule. She actually does a lot of the sales work. She's kind of a multi-job genius at Spec, basically. But that has really helped, because what that means is the time that I spend working on Developer T can be 100% focused on production and creativity. And I use that word kind of tentatively, because I don't mean like just thinking creatively. I mean quite literally coming up with ideas for episodes.
Sure.
So that's really the hurdle for me. Recording the episodes, because they're short, doesn't take a ton of time, which is another benefit of that format, right? Recording them doesn't take a lot of time. Coming up with the idea is the most taxing part of it. And so allowing me to spend the time coming up with the idea, that's hugely important. So having that team, if let's say you're starting a podcast soon and you want to, get to that same spot, then outsourcing would be the way to do that, right? If you don't have a team, then outsourcing some of the editing work is actually surprisingly not too expensive to do. And especially if you're looking to make this kind of a professional endeavor, is probably worth it.
Okay.
So I don't want to undersell that. But there are some other things that I do that I think can help pretty much anybody. So I'm going to kind of go through those. The first one is that I leave my setup ready to basically press record at any time. So that means like I never take my mic down. My computer stays perpetually on, and all of my recording gear is just ready to go, right? I have one spot that I do these episodes in, unless I'm traveling to a conference or something. But typically, 9 times out of 10, I'm doing it right here, standing in front of this desk that I'm staring at right now. And as long as I have that stuff set up, then I know that the barrier to actually getting something started and recording, I just press 2 or 3 buttons and I'm going, right? And it's kind of like that, there's been some stuff that's been coming out recently about barrier to entry when it comes to working out. And the recommendation now is put on your gym clothes. And then if you still don't want to work out, then you don't have to, right? That first, whatever that first hurdle is, if you can make that first hurdle as small as possible or eliminate it entirely, right? Then progress is going to be easier for you. That's thing number 1.
Yeah.
Thing number 2 that I do to keep this schedule up is I don't get so attached to an idea that I let it, like I don't record an idea and not release it, right? Like I don't waste time being so overly critical of the stuff that I'm recording or the ideas that I have, that I let it like destroy an entire recording session. I try to be as critical as possible on the front end, but ultimately, I have over 400 episodes. If one of them is bad, that's okay. If I fail miserably on like 5 episodes in a row, that's actually not the end of the world, right? It's not horrible. If I stop recording, if I lose my schedule, that is bad. Because once you throw that off, it's very difficult to come back from that. So the lesson to be learned there is take the idea as more valuable than you expect it to be. In other words, you can have an idea for an episode, you can have an idea for a product, you can have an idea for pretty much anything you want to make, and you're going to have self-doubts that ultimately could kill it entirely. And that means that it never even has a chance to prove itself. Your idea is just, it dies. You already fail when you do that, right? Instead, especially when you're doing stuff like publishing stuff like this, it's okay to have a few bad ones in there, right? It's okay to release something that ultimately, if you could go back and erase it, you might, but not everybody's going to like everything you do. And that's okay.
Yeah, of course. I had a conversation with some friends of mine a few episodes ago now, where I firstly, I was struggling to think of a topic. It was I didn't have a guest on, so I wanted to stick to a schedule, but I didn't really have a topic to talk about. And they encouraged me to basically. I had a few ideas, and they basically encouraged me to do it no matter what. And I had a bit of a sore throat that day as well, so the recording didn't come out good. And I was very close to just scrapping it and thinking, you know what, I'll just redo it some other time, or I'll just skip this week. But yeah, my friends, they sort of talked me into it, and they said, no, you got to stick to your schedule no matter what. It doesn't really matter about the quality. It doesn't matter about the topic. Even if it's a 2-minute episode, it's better than zero. And yeah, I was really glad that I pushed it out. I still do find it quite difficult to stick to the sort of schedule that you're on. Obviously, a couple of times a week. My episodes come out maybe once a fortnight.
Yeah.
But you know, that's just something that I'm trying to work on as well. But yeah, no, that's really good advice that you've given there, and it's interesting to know your process as well. And I think it's really important how you've got your setup ready to go all the time. Unfortunately, I don't really have space in the house to have a permanent setup, so after each recording, I do pack my microphone away, and it goes into a box and gets put, in the cupboard sort of thing. And then when I'm ready to record, I kind of need to wait till the house has quietened down a bit, and then I do my recording in the lounge because I don't have a specific space where I could do it. And I need to wait until, the rest of the family's not in the lounge and they're doing their own thing. And yeah, it is a barrier, and it doesn't stop you from keeping up that schedule and keeping up the flow. But
yeah.
Well,
and for people who are in similar situations, and for you, I would recommend a few things. One, schedule time that is going to be successful, right?
Yeah.
So
I always do record at the same time. I always record in the evening, from around about 8:30 to 9 o'clock. Today we're recording a bit later because of time zones, but that's fine. But generally, when I'm doing an episode by myself, or I've got a good guest that's in the UK as well, I'll try and schedule it in around 8:30, 9 o'clock, because generally that's a good time when people are winding down for the evening and they've got some free time. Yeah, it
is a difficult thing. It's space is important for audio production, and having that barrier, it absolutely is going to affect it. So another thing, though, that may help, and this is less related to, the procedural side or the recording side, and it's more related to the idea generation side. Because for me, that's really important. Putting out 3 episodes a week means I have to come up with something around 150, valuable and unique ideas in a given year for episodes. And that can be daunting, but what I've found is if I separate and batch that idea generation process away from producing an episode. So in other words, if I try to generate, I call it a blast file, which is kind of a weird title, I guess, but I have a file in my note-taking application called Developer T Blast. And what I do in that file is I try to, every time I touch it, I try to come up with 5 to 10 ideas for episodes. Now, the key here for anybody who is listening and you want to generate ideas like this, the key is don't judge the ideas as you're going through them, right? So like, in other words, don't stop yourself from putting something down. And this is just a basic brainstorming technique. It's nothing new. But employing it in this way, basically it means that I have this treasure trove of like a massive list of things that I can pull from whenever I'm feeling like, my brain's not firing on all 6 cylinders today, right? I'm slow today. Well, I can go and look at this place where I've captured that brainstorming.
And do you try and create some sort of schedule at that point, or do you come back to that later and cherry pick the ones that you want to do in the order you want to do them?
I'm really bad about scheduling. That is one place where I'm horrible. A lot of times I have recorded an episode the day before it airs. There's been plenty of times where I've been, 3 or 4 weeks out in front. And it vacillates. I'm really quite bad at sticking to a specific schedule, partially because, especially with having a son and a child in my house now, it becomes a little bit more undeterminable, right? It's difficult to know exactly when I'm going to be free and exactly, and as a CTO of a company, I have to remain relatively flexible on that end too. So, the only real protected time that I could ever really have is super early in the morning. And for whatever reason, my brain is not ready to record a podcast at 5 a.m. So,
No.
And not to mention guests, right? So that's another factor in all of this. So I'm really bad at scheduling. What I'm actually okay at doing with this list, and what I found is kind of the valuable thing for me, is when I have a spark that comes from that list. If I look at the list and I say, wow, I have like 6 ideas right now on that particular title, right? That's basically what this list is a bunch of titles with maybe like a 1-sentence explanation of what that could be about. Immediately, if I record it, I can get an episode done. And that's like that, having that has been the key to being able to stay on schedule for me. It's less about finding a specific time, even though I would benefit from that. I need to preach that message to myself, certainly. But I've been able to succeed by being able to translate a spark into a finished thing and doing it in, a short period of time.
No, that's brilliant. And I think the fact that you obviously hand off the editing to another member of the team as well just means that you can dump out your ideas in your microphone.
Yes.
And not worry about any retakes or any cutting out any umming and ahhing and all that fun stuff of editing.
Yeah.
I actually quite enjoy the editing process. I do the editing myself. So
it is fun. It is fun.
Yeah,
I actually kind of miss it.
Yeah, I do like doing it, and I do try and make it as polished as possible. So I might, on an episode which is going on an hour like we are today, I might spend about 2.5 to 3 hours on doing the edit. Mm-hmm. So I will generally record on a particular day towards the end of the week. Like today we're recording on a Thursday. I normally record on a Thursday or a Friday, and then I spend maybe a couple of hours on like a Sunday evening doing the editing, and then publish on a Monday or Tuesday. And yeah, I really enjoy it. But it is a time-consuming process, and I understand why you've got someone in your team to do that for you, so that you can focus on the actual the talking and the recording.
It's kind of an interesting thing, and I haven't talked about this, I don't think, ever on an interview, but the way that I record my monologue episodes, you might consider that editing as I go.
Right.
Because I'm pretty quick with the recording software. Like I'm proficient with it because I've been using it for so long, like much longer than I've been recording podcasts. So I can pretty quickly like jump back and do a retake, right? And that's easy for me to do. So it makes Sarah's job, the editing, much faster. And you can't really do that with an interview style thing, right? So like if I didn't word something correctly, I can stop it and cut that and redo it. And she doesn't have to do a lot of that deep editing. It's more like she's making space for sponsors, or she's organizing where the music goes or whatever it is, but it makes her job a little bit faster as well.
Yeah, definitely. With the interview type of episodes for me as well, most of the time is spent getting rid of like crosstalk, and just adding a little bit of space between the conversation as well, just to give it a bit of room to breathe sometimes. But yeah, like you said, with the monologue ones, it is a lot quicker, and you do have the flexibility of stopping and starting.
Sure.
I find the monologues a little bit harder. I don't know, I just find it a bit difficult talking by myself about a topic, and so I find that those edits do take me longer because I do stop and start a lot more as well.
Like anything, it took me a lot of practice to get to the place where I feel comfortable with that.
Yeah, maybe so I've been going since March, so I'm sort of 2.5 years behind you at the moment.
It gets easier.
Yeah, it has been getting easier. Yeah, the first episode I remember, I was a nervous wreck when I first started, but now I'm fine with it now, and I really enjoy it.
Yeah,
So
I probably spent a full day on my first 10-minute episode. You know, like it's taxing.
yeah, my first one was a little teaser of what's to come, and it just took forever. I mean,
Yeah,
the teaser
yeah.
took longer than the actual first episode, which is funny. So when you teamed up with Brian and Bryn to join Spec, did you already know them beforehand, or was this like internet friends?
This is actually a connection I made on Twitter with Bren. Bren reached out. He's very good at communicating with people he doesn't know, which makes him a great interviewer. But he reached out and basically, you know, we kind of talked for a little while before we decided to actually start a business. So we kind of knew each other, you know, we knew of each other, and then, you know, but we didn't know each other before we started podcasting. So it was entirely driven off of this. In fact, and this is the very strange fact about our history together. They started their podcast, if I remember correctly, on the same exact day. I think on the same day that we started ours.
So you were competition to start with.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's kind of weird because it's like a Venn diagram. You know, they have a lot of people who would never listen to Developer T, and I have a lot of people who would never really listen to Design Details. But we do have that overlap of, like you, who would listen to both.
Yeah, I was a subscriber of both before Spec started. And
That's so cool. Yeah.
Then all of a sudden, I noticed that you both got this little logo on your show artwork, and
like, what is that coming from?
Part of the same team, yeah. When you had the S in the circle, which is
yeah.
And I was, I listen to Design Details now as well, and I like their format as well, where they've got interviews with obviously loads of people in the design industry. But yeah, they're really good at what they do. Brilliant. So how do you guys expand the network? How do you sort of decide which podcasts you pull into the network?
By and large, the people who have joined the network, they have come from mostly the Valley, right? So Brain and Brian, they both live in San Francisco, and I live out here in this kind of barren place of Tennessee, right? Even though there's a lot of growth in tech, and there's actually quite a few podcasts that are popping up out of Chattanooga. It's not nearly the same as what's happening in California. So they have largely been responsible for making those connections and finding people who are doing really interesting stuff and bringing them into the Spec network. So, I haven't been extremely involved in each of those decisions, but really it comes down to, are you making something that kind of fits the mission of what Spec was intended in the beginning for? And are you making it to a quality level that is, that we can see that it's going to do well for you and for us?
Yeah, the Spec Network is brilliant. I mean, all the shows are really good on there. I listen to the ones I listen to the most are probably Design Details, obviously Developer T, Immutable is a one that I listen to a lot. And I used to listen to one of the I can't remember the name of it now. The one that Sam Surface does, his iOS one. It was just while I was learning a bit of iOS development, but I've kind of put that onto a bit of a back burner now. But yeah, they're all really good. They've all got the same sort of quality, and it's a brilliant network. So if anyone who's listening hasn't subscribed to the Spec Network, you definitely need to have a look at all the podcasts on there as well.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. And if you haven't subscribed to Inspect yet, you should click subscribe in your podcast app right now.
Yeah. Thank you. So what else are you working on right now, and what's the sort of future with Spec and Developer T, and have you got any plans that you in the pipeline?
Good questions all around. Yeah. So Developer T is not going anywhere anytime soon. I see no reason to stop it. And a lot of people, they do these things for a run, and we might play with the format. I've definitely considered going into video. I think it's a very important space that I'm not really, haven't really pushed into at all. But I think there's a lot of opportunity for interesting engagement and, slightly different types of content, like explaining, difficult math concepts, for example. That's not really something I can do super effectively in a podcast format, but I
Yeah.
might be able to do that with video, right? It's also a more saturated format, so that comes with its own challenges. I've certainly considered building course materials, something that I really believe a significant portion of my future is going to be in teaching other people. And what better way to start than creating online course material, right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of in the back of my mind and on the horizon a little bit. The network is going to continue in its current form for now, and very likely will grow as new media opportunities are presented. So, for example, Apple is kind of moving podcast meta to support at a native level this concept of seasons.
Yes.
And Developer T has never had seasons, right? Which we're always on. It's like the news or something, right? Because, the season type podcasts are typically going to be story driven or, but a lot of people are attaching to this concept of recording and releasing seasons and doing a little bit more work per episode. High production value stuff. The NPR podcasts obviously were kind of on the forefront of that and have created a new type of podcast. So, I'd love to see, and I don't know if this is going to happen in the near future or not. I'd love to see that kind of thing on the Spec network. I think we have a big opportunity to create good media in that space too.
Definitely, yeah. Yeah, some of the stuff that obviously NPR, the production value on some of their podcasts is amazing. You can obviously tell that they've got a lot of people working on them, and they've got a good budget, and they've got a lot of time and dedication.
Yeah, very well
for
resourced.
that
Yeah.
stuff. Yeah, definitely. It is a big publishing platform, isn't it, NPR? But yeah, there's absolutely no reason why Spec couldn't get there. It's definitely got the talent, and it's got the content, and it's got the following as well. Just by looking at the Slack channel, you can see how many people are interested in the content, where Slack is kind of over capacity now, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, we've moved to Spectrum now.
Of course, yeah.
Officially, the community is on Spectrum, and that allows us to kind of open up a little bit more and invite different types of conversation as well.
Yeah. Yeah, which brings me nicely on to just before we sort of wrap up, is there anything that you'd like to plug, and where can people find out more about you and
Well, sure.
the work you do? Yeah.
I'd love to ask you a couple of questions as well.
Okay, sure.
Before we close out, these are questions that I usually ask on Developer T, but I like to ask them as a guest too, because people want to hear about you.
Yeah, sure.
Hopefully as much or more than they want to hear about you. The first question that I like to ask is, if you and I were to go and grab a cup of tea together, sit down and have an hour to talk, what do you wish I would talk to you about or ask you about?
Okay, so I mentioned earlier that I kind of started off as a designer while I was at university. I didn't study design, but it was always like a passion of mine. And when I first got into sort of working in the industry, I was working as a designer full time for quite a few years, and then I've sort of transitioned into a developer over the past 5 or 6 years, front end developer. And I think a lot of people who kind of know me now, they know me as a developer. But it's always I always love talking about design as well, and I love talking about things like composition and typography and color theory and logo design and things like that. And I like talking about the way that you can kind of bridge the gap between designers and developers, and how they can work together more efficiently and sort of help each other in their roles and help produce like a more polished product in the end. So yeah, if anyone does ever meet me and start talking about development, let's talk about design as well, and let's talk about the whole picture, not just sort of go down one avenue. Let's talk about the whole process of design development, front end, back end. I like to sort of get my fingers in a lot of the pies as well. user experience and all that sort of thing as well.
That's excellent because it truly is, I actually just did an episode of Developer Tea on this subject. It is a trait of great developers to zoom out and look at how what they do affects the larger whole, right?
Yeah.
How does development affect, how does the thing that I'm creating, for example, and this is why, right? If you are a software developer and you want to optimize your software, ask the question, why? Why do I want to optimize the software, right? If you ask the question why a few times, a lot of times the younger or developers who are limited in their perspective, they will end up at I'm not sure, or I don't know. I'm not sure why, but I know I'm supposed to, right? I know it's the right thing. I feel somebody has told me before that to be a good developer, I need to have fast software. So that's why I'm doing it. But the truth is, optimizing your software has a value, an underlying value that connects to the other parts of the system. Whatever it is that you're building, that optimization should be with relation to the other things. I saw a tweet recently from somebody who works on the React core team, I believe. He was talking about a common complaint from developers, or kind of this like best practice. He basically presented it as a myth that creating functions in your render call is going to make your program slower.
Yes.
And he created a test case for this and basically said it's imperceptible how much slower it is. It's like you can create a new function. You can do like 5 million of them per second. So there's no perception level that you can have or that your users are going to have. It's going to defeat that and make that optimization worth your time. And so just optimizing for the sake of optimizing would have you remove code like functions in your rendering that could be extremely valuable from the human readability perspective, right? And there's so many other things we could talk about there, but it's really good that you have that as kind of a value and a driving core, piece of how you think, because having that integration, that integrated perspective is so important to creating good products and in collaboration.
Yeah. I actually saw that tweet as well. It was by a chap called Ryan Florence.
That's right.
And
Ryan.
Yeah, and it was about having arrow functions defined in the render method.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And he had a few JS performance tests and showing how sort of negligible the difference was. And it's really interesting to sort of take a step back and look at it from that perspective as well. So that's something I'd like to. I enjoy talking about. I do enjoy talking to people outside of development about the bigger picture.
Yeah, that's great. And the second question that I want to ask you, if you had 30 seconds of advice to give to developers of any background or any experience level, so really any developer, what would you tell them?
You're not timing this, are you? I haven't actually got 30 seconds. Okay, so I would say don't be afraid to show other people what you're doing and what you're working on. Share your ideas with the community. Share them with your peers. Don't really sort of be afraid that people might steal your ideas. If you've got an idea for the next big thing app, an idea is nothing without execution, really. So by sharing your ideas, it may help you execute it. And if you can inspire someone else to help you, or to sort of critique your work, or give you some sort of evaluation, then that could help you in achieve what you're trying to achieve as well. The community, the tech community, is really good, especially on Twitter. People do tend to give really good feedback. Just tell people what you're doing, and be quite open.
That is such a great piece of advice, and perhaps you know, it's so good because most people don't do this well. Criticism and coaching and guidance and feedback, these are all things that are extremely difficult to receive, just as a human, right? It's harder for some people, and also something that you have to practice, because a lot of times, you know, it's very easy to walk into a session where you're going to receive feedback and feel very connected and confident to the thing that you've created. And when you receive negative feedback, it can be really defeating, right? You can attach a lot of emotion to it, and that can be difficult to overcome. But if you practice this, and if you actually act on it, right? If you don't quit and roll over and say, all right, well, since that was bad, then I'm done. Instead, if you say, okay, I'm going to actually take this feedback, I'm going to act on it, I'm going to trust that I don't know everything. I did another episode recently on the concept of humility, and how humility is the base, kind of the foundation core for everything that we do as developers. Humility is what allows you to learn, right? It's what allows you to collaborate. It's what allows you to understand the value that other people provide to the project, even when you can't perceive it. It's what makes you realize that you still have work to do. So that's kind of a core concept. And if you can't find humility, then you're never going to be teachable, right? And so taking that feedback and really actually seeking feedback, seeking the opinions of others, you know, what you're going to realize is a lot of times you're going to be right, and a lot of times you're going to be wrong. And you have to be able to be wrong to be a good developer.
It doesn't really matter whether you're right or wrong. The main thing is that you've got a concept in your head, and you've got an idea, and you're thinking about it, and you're seeking some help and advice from other people. And if you're right, you can help other people. If you're wrong, they'll probably be able to help you.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, so I could probably say that in 30 seconds, I reckon.
That's all right. That's good.
Okay, brilliant. That's all I've got from my list, and you know, it's been a pleasure having you on the show. You know, we finally got there. Finally managed to schedule it in. It's just like I said before. If there's anything where can people find out more about you? You know, where are you active, and how do they find out who Jonathan Cutrell is?
I am on Twitter personally at jcutrell. You can find the Developer T Twitter account at Developer T. So those are pretty easy. I'm most active on Developer T, to be honest with you. You can find it in any podcasting app, of course, iTunes. So it's just search Developer, and it'll probably come up because, believe it or not, there's not a lot of podcasts for developers with developer in the title. So Developer T, and then that's pretty much all I really push. And then, of course, if you want to learn more about what I do with Whiteboard, you can find more information on that at whiteboard.is, whiteboard.is. And I'm open to email too. If anybody wants to reach out to me, developerT@gmail.com is a perfectly fine place to send me a message.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, and I'll put a bunch of links to all of your stuff in the show notes as well. So have a look at the show notes in your podcast player or on the website at inspect.fm. But yeah, just to wrap up, you know, thanks for being on the show, and I'd love to have you on as guest again sometime in the future, and maybe we could talk about what you're working on in the future, and where Spec and the whole network has gone, and yeah, pick some topics and have a bit of a deep dive.
Sounds like a plan. I'd love to come back. It was very enjoyable. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. And you've given some brilliant advice. I think a lot of people will get a lot of valuable information out of this episode. So yeah, thanks again.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
All right, brilliant. Thanks. Take care.